Hello, everybody, and welcome to Theology 101. Today I'm going to give you a lesson from my online course on how to study the Bible. This lesson will go over the framework for understanding the Bible. What is a covenant? Well, let's think of some types of covenants we make today. A covenant is another word for promise or contract. For example, if you're married, then on your wedding day you made a covenant or a promise to be faithful to your spouse. Or if you live in an apartment, you signed a contract which says that you will fulfill certain things while your landlord will fulfill other things. So whether it's a contract or a promise, these are all different types of covenants. This is what a covenant is in the Bible. Let me give you a definition of a covenant. A binding and solemn agreement made by two or more individuals or parties to do or keep from doing a specific thing. You see, God works in history with His people through His covenants. And what we will see is that covenants are binding. Now, there are two types of covenants we see in the Bible: an unconditional covenant or a conditional covenant. An unconditional covenant is a one-way covenant that God makes with His people. These covenants are things that God promises to fulfill regardless of how His people respond to Him. This is closely related to an idea of a promise. You promise to do something for your child even if he or she doesn't obey you at times. However, there are other covenants that are considered conditional covenants. This is closer to the idea of a contract. So if you sign the lease for your apartment, for example, well, there are conditions that you must uphold and your landlord must uphold. And if one of you doesn't fulfill that contract, then that covenant is broken. God does the same thing with His people. He makes certain conditional covenants at times where it is contingent on whether His people will do certain things for Him, and He will do certain things for them. However, if His people do not obey His words, then He doesn't uphold His part of the covenant. Now, when we talk about a covenant, oftentimes there's a sign that is associated with that covenant. For example, talking about marriage. Marriage is a covenant. It's a promise you make between you and your spouse. Now, what is the sign of that covenant? A ring, right? This ring is a symbol to remind you of the conditions of your covenant or promise that you made. And when we go over these different covenants God makes with His people, typically there will always be a sign, a physical picture that reminds us the conditions of that covenant. Now, let me briefly go over the 6 covenants in the Bible. The first covenant is called the Noahic covenant. This is the promise God made with Noah. This happened after the flood, and He promised that He will never ever send another flood or destroy His earth again. The second covenant is called the Abrahamic covenant. This is a promise God made with Abraham and his descendants. The next covenant is what we call the Mosaic covenant, and this is a contract that God made with Moses and the people of Israel, and this covenant was binding until we get to the death and resurrection of Jesus. The priestly covenant is a promise God made with Phinehas, who was a priest, and his descendants. The Davidic covenant is a covenant that God made with David and his descendants. And finally, the new covenant, which all Christians are familiar with today, it's a promise Jesus made with the church, and this covenant was ratified or started with the death of Jesus on the cross. If you're finding this lesson valuable, please consider taking this entire online course by clicking the link below in the description box. Now back to the lesson. Now at this point, I want you to pull out that covenant timeline. And what I want you to see is that every book of the Bible can be categorized by which covenant they emphasize or shed light on. If you notice the different colors, it tells you which covenant they represent. Also, if you notice that color line is thick for certain books or thin for certain books. When it is thick, that means that covenant is at the forefront of that book. And when it is thin, that means that covenant is not the main point of that book of the Bible. Now, what happens is that certain books of the Bible might have multiple covenants playing at the same time. Now, if you look at this covenant timeline, do you notice something different about the Mosaic covenant versus all the other covenants? The Mosaic covenant stops when you get to the cross, whereas all the other covenants continue on after the cross. This is going to be important to understand the relationship between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The differences we see between Israel and the church, or how God relates with Israel and the church, is seen primarily when you understand the difference between the Mosaic and the New Covenant. And again, do you notice that the New Covenant is mentioned briefly in the Old Testament at a few places, but really becomes the main emphasis after the cross. And so I want you to spend some time looking over this covenant timeline. And even when you read the Bible on your own, this will help you understand what the point is of that book. For example, 1 Samuel should be emphasizing the Davidic covenant, because we are eventually introduced to King David, and it is with King David that God makes a promise, which is what we call the Davidic covenant. Or if you're reading the first 5 books of the Bible, you notice that the Abrahamic covenant and then later the Mosaic covenant are the main emphasis of that book. And so feel free to use this PDF to help you categorize the different books of the Bible so that you know which covenant is being emphasized at that time. Now let me go over what each of the 6 covenants reveal about God's character. The Noahic covenant reveals God's mercy. Now why do I say it reveals God's mercy? Because mercy by definition means that God withholds punishment from us when we deserve it. And if you recall the story of the flood, you know that the whole world justly received judgment from God for being so corrupt and evil. But God makes a promise that he will never flood the earth again. However, did the flood really solve the problem of sin? Did people stop being evil and corrupt after the flood? No. So God technically should have kept sending a flood every generation after Noah, because people after the flood were just as evil as people before the flood. However, God does not send another flood since the time of Noah, not because people got better or the sin problem was solved, but because of his covenant which he makes with Noah, which reveals his mercy. The Abrahamic covenant reveals God's blessings and provision. He promises Abraham and his physical descendants that he will give them land, that he will bless them as a nation, and we know this nation to later be Israel. And we see that these physical blessings continue to be unfolded throughout the Old Testament, even during times when they are disobedient. However, we're going to see later that Jesus will be coming from the Abrahamic covenant, and he will provide spiritual blessings to all people, even people who are not a part of Israel, through his death and resurrection. The Mosaic covenant reveals God's justice. This is what we call the law. These are all the commandments and standards that God has placed for his people to live up to. And justice means that this is a standard of righteousness that he expects his people to fulfill. The priestly covenant reveals God's sacrifice. Priests were appointed to represent God's people by offering an animal sacrifice on their behalf. Well, we're going to see in the priestly covenant that this points to a greater sacrifice that God will provide through a greater priest who will bring atonement or forgiveness for his people. The Davidic covenant reveals God's authority. This covenant highlights the future king who will rule in God's kingdom on earth. And this covenant also shows the type of authority that he will have over not just Israel, but all the nations of the world. And finally, the new covenant reveals God's redemption. This is how he buys his people by paying the price for their salvation. And we see that the price ends up being his son's blood on the cross. And so what we see with these 6 covenants is that they all reveal a different attribute or characteristic about God, and they also ultimately reveal a different aspect of God's kingdom plan or restoration process. You see, the restoration process that God is doing through the seed of Eve is to ultimately have his kingdom here on earth. And so let me go over the 6 covenants again, but instead of showing how they connect with God's character, I want to also show how they connect to the concept of the kingdom. The Noahic covenant reveals the place where God's kingdom will be. By promising that he will never destroy the earth again, God does so because this earth will be renovated to become the new earth, which will be the final resting place of Jesus and his kingdom on earth forever. The Abrahamic covenant points to the nations who will be a part of the kingdom and be blessed in the kingdom. It primarily focuses on Israel throughout the Old Testament, but we see that the blessings of the Abrahamic covenant extends to all nations so that every nation will be in the kingdom and be blessed in the kingdom forever. The Mosaic covenant reveals the standard that a person must live up to be a part of his kingdom. And the priestly covenant reveals the necessary sacrifice that God has to do on his kingdom citizens' behalf so that they could receive forgiveness of sins and be a part of his kingdom. The Davidic covenant reveals who the king of the final kingdom will be, and the new covenant reveals the way an individual can be justified or be found not guilty so that they could fulfill the Mosaic covenant and be a part of God's kingdom on earth. And so do you notice how if you understand these 6 covenants, What you will ultimately understand is not only God's character, but you will also understand how God's kingdom plan will be seen in the end. Now, how many of you guys know who Bach is? He is considered the father of Baroque music, and he's somebody that I had to study a lot because I grew up playing the cello. My mom was a violin teacher, so I was just drilled with a lot of music theory and history. Well, there's something unique about Bach. When Bach was towards the end of his life and he knew that he was going to die soon, he created something that will allow his name to live on forever. He wrote a funeral song, and in the final part of the funeral song, Bach used the same 4 notes in the same order. The 4 notes that he kept repeating was B flat, A, C, and B natural. Now, the way that you will write these notes during that time will be this way. B for B flat, A for A, C for C, and H for B natural because the H represented the natural sign. So the idea was that Bach wanted his name to live on forever whenever this song was played. As long as you play the notes correctly, then the listeners will always hear B, A, C, H, B, A, C, H. Do you want to know how God spells his name throughout the Bible? Noahic covenant, Abrahamic covenant, Mosaic covenant, priestly covenant, Davidic covenant, new covenant. And as long as we understand these 6 covenants correctly, not only do we understand the big storyline of the Bible, but ultimately God's name will live on forever. And so we see how important it is to know these 6 covenants, because these 6 covenants is the paradigm by which you can understand the entire Bible. If you want to dig deeper into this course, I'll provide a link below in the description box for my online course on how to study the Bible. Until next time, see you.